Welcome to the Library of Mistakes. If you haven't been here before, we are a free public library, and you can come to the Library of Mistakes by registering at our website and making an appointment, and you can come anytime from 9 to 5, Monday to Saturday. So welcome to your library. The Library of Mistakes also has another venture, which I'm now advertising, so you didn't get away for free, which is a course called The Practical History of Financial Markets. So if you're interested in that, you can find that on our website. Didasko, D-I-D-A-S-K-O. It runs in an in-person format in London for 2.5 days. It runs online as a video-only version, so you can do and take that anytime that you like. We also have podcasts, so you'll be notified of the podcasts. And the next one coming up soon will be on the author of the new insight into the collapse of Greensill. I don't know if David Cameron will be listening into that one, but we'll be doing that one. But this evening, it's lecture time, and we are delighted to be joined by Edward Chancellor, who teaches on the course, actually, on 2 of the books he's written, which we have somewhere, The Capital Account and Capital Returns, and The Capital Cycle. Apart from starting as a journalist, Edward wrote Devil Take the Hindmost, A History of Speculation, has been a professional fund manager in Boston with GMO, is still writing not just books, but articles. What have I missed, Edward, in your long, illustrious career?
I think.
That's it?
Yep.
He's almost a man, if you're in financial services, almost a man who needs no introduction. I wanted to begin in introducing Edward's book by going through 2 conflicting opinions on the book. The first is from Bill White, William White, former chief economist of the Bank for International Settlements, who anybody in markets will know of and I think is highly respected. And this is what Bill White said of The Price of Time, Edward's new book, which he's about to talk about. I wish The Price of Time were the book that I had written. I'm reminded of Keynes's letter to Hayek after reading The Road to Serfdom, where he said, "In my opinion, it is a grand book. We have all the greatest reason to be thankful to you for saying so well what needs so much to be said. I find myself in agreement with virtually the whole of it, and not only in agreement, but in a deeply moved agreement," which is, don't get much better than that, but there is actually an even better review of your book than that, which comes from Martin Wolf of the Financial Times, who called it a dangerously unbalanced polemic. And if I ever write another book, I hope Martin gives me such a wonderful review, because it's certainly going to shift a few copies, Edward. So Edward will speak for roughly half an hour on the book. I really don't intend to ask very many questions, because I know there's so many people in this audience who want to ask Edward questions, so we'll go pretty much straight to you to ask questions. And it's taxi for Chancellor at 7:15, because his flight's going, so don't dawdle.
Okay,
Edward, over to you.
Thanks, Russell. This is the first time I've been to this new venue, but I did give one talk at the previous Library of Mistakes, and I seem to have been writing about financial mistakes for the last 25 years and making a few of them myself in between. And today I wanted to talk about this new book, which also contains a whole catalogue of errors, which is about the subject of interest, which I thought was a neglected subject. There were many definitions of interest that I came across when I was working on the book. People call it the price of money or the cost of leverage. One description of interest is a reward for abstinence or an encouragement for savings. An earlier 18th century definition of interest was from an Italian called Ferdinando Galliani. It was the price of anxiety. Galliani said that lending money put one in a state of anxiety, and no one should suffer anxiety without being rewarded. And we know it often as the discount rate or the capitalization rate. Another definition I came across was the price of corporate control. But I, in the end, chose a definition which I wanted to be all-encompassing and that I thought was most important to understand the phenomenon that we were dealing with, which so I called the book The Price of Time, because I thought this was one aspect of interest that perhaps was neglected. And if you go back to the early criticisms of interest in the in ancient Greece, you find Aristotle writing that usury is unnatural because money is intended for exchange, not to increase through the act of lending, and that this idea was then taken up by the medieval scholars such as Thomas Aquinas, who also said that, and other scholars of the period, saying that money was inherently barren and therefore should not increase at lending, and that usury at the time was banned by the Catholic Church. Now, interestingly, a 14th century English scholar called Thomas of Cobham he took all this conventional critique of usury, but he added a twist. He said that the usurer was a time seller, a seller of time, and that this was wrong because time belonged to God, and it was not for anyone to charge for. Now, around this very time, the practice of lending, commercial lending, is taking off in Italy. And with it, shortly afterwards, you get the sort of stirrings of the Renaissance. And part of that, of the Renaissance shift, and the shift of humanism, is to put man rather than God at the center of human affairs, and that then there is a sort of revival of an idea found in ancient Greece, but also in the writings of the Stoic Seneca, of time being important, time being mankind's most precious possession, because life is brief and we must use our time wisely. Then in the 16th century, mid-16th century, there's a final genuine polemic against interest by a man called Thomas Wilson, diplomat and lawyer, who inveighs against interest, reciting all the old well-known criticisms of interest. But he then revives the idea that the usurer is a time seller and talks about time being precious. And it's this insight that time is precious that is then taken up by Benjamin Franklin in his, I think it's Poor Richard's Almanac, with the notion that time is precious and time must be, and that time is money. And then I found when I was writing, doing the research for the Chinese section of this book, that the founder of the first back alley bank in Wenzhou in China, who was a man named Fang, who founded the Ascendant Money House of Kangyang County in the early 1980s, wrote that time is interest. Now, why do we think time is valuable? Economists often talk about the notion of time preference, and you can find that in the writings of the great 18th century French economist called Henri Jacques Turgot. And it was Turgot who first made the observation, which we know commonly, that of a bird in the hand being worth two in the bush. And if you fast forward 250 years, you have this Stanford psychologist by the name of Walter Mischel, who then conducts an experiment on deferred gratification with American preschoolers, and commonly known as the marshmallow test. And what he finds is that that if you offer a reward of an extra marshmallow for children deferring consumption for half an hour, some children will defer the consumption and receive the extra marshmallow, but many won't. And then there's possibly slightly spurious research that find that those who can't resist eating the marshmallow immediately end up in prison or taking drugs, while those who defer consumption become accountants. And from this idea of time preference, an American economist, brilliant economist, an author of a book called The Theory of Interest, Irving Fisher, writes about interest being crystallized in patience. Or earlier, Jeremy Bentham, who wrote a defense of usury, referred to interest as defined interest as the putting out of money at interest, as exchanging present money for future money. So the idea of time value is that the future lies at a discount, and that therefore if you give the difference of value between money today and money in the future is the inherent rate of interest. And the people who believe strongly in the time preference, in particular members of the Austrian School of Economics, believe it to be an attribute, a natural attribute of mankind that can't be expended. Now, what we find then is that time preference also finds its way into the investment process. One of the people I discuss at length in a chapter of the book is John Law, the great Scottish economist, projector, gambler. And Law, in his essay, is it his essay on a land bank that Antoine Murphy ascribes to Law, writes that anticipation is always at a discount. £100 to be paid now is of more value than £1,000 to be paid £10 a year for 100 years. Now, if you think about many people in this room who've been trained in investment and finance would have spent their sort of early days with spreadsheets, learning how to discount future cash flows. And that idea, that practice was sort of formal. I think it's always been understood. You certainly find reference to it in 17th century writings, but that idea was formalized by John Burr Williams, an American economist, in his Theory of Investment Value, published in 1938. And what Williams said, and that's really taken as a sort of canonical today, is that all with the value of shares, for instance, as their value comes from the discounted value of their future dividends. So, without a discount rate, as the economist Ludwig von Mises says, then an apple in 100 years' time would be worth the same as an apple today. Or even you go back earlier, Sir William Petty, a 17th century English economist, said that without a discount rate, or I didn't use the term discount rate, but without interest, it would be that 1 acre of land would be worth the same as 20,000 acres of land. You couldn't have any sane method of valuation without interest. And you find this, what's interesting in particular about John Law is he has this sort of these flashes of insight, and then he goes to France and persuades the regents of France after the death of Louis XIV, the Duke of Orleans, in the period between sort of 1715 and 1719. He manages to persuade the regent that he's the man to set up a bank that becomes France's first central bank, to replace a gold currency with a paper currency. And that's all well known, but one of the things that's sort of neglected about Law is that he is an advocate of low interest. And what Law does by establishing his central bank is effectively bring the rate of interest down from that prevailing at the time of Louis XIV's death, about sort of 6 to 8% on government debt, down to 2%. And as the interest rate comes down during this period, at a time when Law is in effect, doubling the money supply in France with his paper currency, the valuation of his Mississippi company, as we call it, rises around 20-fold in the space of really, I think, less than a year. And law says the company is perfectly reasonably valued because it's on a price-earnings ratio of 50 times or an earnings yield of 2%, which is the same as the prevailing interest. And long afterwards, the Scottish economist Sir James Stewart commented on Law's scheme, saying the value in capital really existed relative to the rate of interest at the time. Now, as you all know, Law's scheme didn't turn out to be a resounding success, but that didn't stop the central bankers, our current central bankers, from really modeling their actions on Law's own activities. And Antoine Murphy, the biographer of Law and of Richard Cantillon, Law's great contemporary, wrote a paper 2 or 3 years ago saying that Mario Draghi, the ECB, Janet Yellen at the Fed, and Ben Bernanke, her predecessor, were the heirs of Law, notwithstanding Law's failure. One of the interesting comments made about speculation by another biographer of Law, James Buchan, whose excellent book is also in this library. Buchan writes actually, he doesn't make this comment in that book, but in something he wrote about Law 20 years earlier. The great stock market bull seeks to condense the future into a few days and to discount the long march of history and capture the present value of all future riches. And so what Buchan is really saying is the speculator is making an error with his discount rate. And I think that is one of the points I'm trying to make in this book, that I don't think I made sufficiently or clearly enough when I wrote A History of Speculation, is all the great speculative bubbles seem to be accompanied by a decline in the discount rate, and most recently by a forced reduction to extraordinarily low levels of interest. Now, so I've discussed to you about the psychology of interest, personal psychology, how it works in valuation, but interest also works in determining the allocation of capital. There was another Scottish economist, very little known, called John Ray. It wasn't a great success, I don't think, in his lifetime, but one of, I think, early 19th century, and one of Ray's comments, or his great contribution of economist, was to see that investment required capital being tied up for periods of time, and that therefore the interest rate would influence how the type of investments that take place, or what later economists would talk about, time in production. And that's an insight that was later taken up by Victorian economist W.S. Jevons, and also is really the sort of the lodestone of the thinking of the Austrian school of economics, of how, and from that you get the notion that a lower interest rate will lead to an extension of the structure of production, as they would call it, or what we might call the investing in projects with longer payback dates. And I think linked to this is the question of sort of the vitality of the economic process. I'm sorry to just be citing the names of economists, but my favorite economist, possibly, Joseph Schumpeter, is an economist associated with the description of an economy being a dynamic evolutionary process characterized by what he called creative destruction. And long before, well, a generation or two before Schumpeter, an economist who was president of Princeton, no, sorry, Yale, called Hadley, argued that actually interest ensured the process of natural selection by taking assets from those who had a low rate of return and giving them to those who could secure a higher rate of return. I think that has, you know, or at least I argue, I think this has a lot of relevance to what we've been experiencing over the last 13 or 14 years, the period of extraordinarily low productivity growth and of lackluster economic performance since the global financial crisis, when, as you remember, interest rates in the developed world were taken down to zero by the central banks, or the policy rates were, and less than zero in some countries. And Russell and my friend Jim Grant made two comment several years ago where he cited a friend of his, a colleague of his, saying that comparing interest to the shot clock in basketball, whereas there's a penalty in basketball, you only have professional basketball, a clock is held and you're only allowed to take 30 seconds before you lose possession if you don't take the penalty. What Jim was saying is that without without a rate of interest, you were slowing the shot clock down. Or as he then says, that interest was like playing like regulating the tempo of the economy, like music going from adagio to larghetto to largo, grave, adagissimo, largissimo. And I say that carry on like this, then the music that we move to is a sort of funeral march. And what we found, and numerous people have commented over the recent years, is that the low rate of interest has reduced the rate of corporate bankruptcies and kept many businesses afloat that would probably otherwise have gone bust. And we call those businesses zombies. And we find them, they first appeared in Japan, not coincidentally the first country that adopted the zero interest rate policy. And since then, the zombie phenomenon has spread around the world. We find many corporate zombies in China, large number in Europe, particularly in Italy, and quite a few in the United States. And the zombie is a company that has, I think, sort of harmful macroeconomic effects, because research suggests that zombie companies, when they dominate a specific sector, that they invest less, have lower returns on capital, less employment growth, and in particular, they discourage new entrants. And so if you have no new entrants and lock in very low returns, and that process becomes widespread enough, then in aggregate, the consequence is a decline in productivity. But the zombie phenomenon is actually not restricted to these businesses that should really have died. It's also actually encompasses businesses that shouldn't actually have been founded, namely the unicorns and the investment in tech companies that we've seen in recent years, many of which really appear to have no prospect of actually delivering a decent return on capital over the long term, but were really founded, established in an age of easy money when investors were looking for what the Americans call moonshots, and in which a bubbly or speculative financial market was prepared to put a high valuation on businesses, on these businesses. So I think I read somewhere some tech investor saying, in a sort of startup, saying that the aim of this business is to solve for capitalization. In other words, there was no real aim beyond that. So the invention of interest, the interest goes back into sort of time immemorial. It's the first records we have of human activity show that interest was taking place. And if one looks at the etymology of interest in various ancient languages, on the whole, they refer to the productivity of loans, to sort of calves, to cattle, to the fecundity of loans. So we can imagine, at least, that the first lending, prehistorical lending, was among early farmers. But a point made by an economic historian, which I think is correct, is that interest is the most important invention in the history of finance because it allows people to transact across time. And all economic activity takes place across time. And the way I try and envisage this is that there is a bridge between the time and the present, between the present and the future, and we are moving consumption across this bridge, either bringing it forward with loans or deferring it through savings and investment. And it's very important that sort of the traffic on this bridge is regulated, because if it's not regulated, we might bring all our consumption from the future into the present, in which case, when the future arrives, we've got nothing. And I think that the rate of interest is like a toll on this intertemporal bridge to assure an orderly traffic and to assure that our consumption today is not so excessive that we can't meet our consumption needs in future. That we, as I mentioned already, the interest is both an incentive to save, but also reflects and regulates, and both reflects and determines the return on capital. And your return on capital the return on your savings is going to determine what your future consumption will be. And so the way I see it, really I think our interest rate experiment didn't really begin after the global financial crisis, but actually after the dot-com bust. I mean, some might argue it happened earlier, but we can say that it definitely happened after the dot-com bust in 2000 and, in 2002, when the Federal Reserve set U.S. Fed funds rate at 1%. The U.S. dollar being the world's global reserve currency, that seems to me the sort of starting point of the great credit boom, and households, if you will, drawing consumption from the future and across something that the central bankers themselves in the records deliberately wanted, drawing their consumption from the future into the present, and then finding in the real estate bust in the US, followed by the credit bust that actually they had overconsumed, and that this mismanagement of our sort of intertemporal activities, of our savings and investments, has continued. And so I'm going to just end with some comment. Yes, just what we've been through in the last couple of years, which was when I was in the great lockdown bubble, and when that was happening, the first thought that occurred to me about the lockdowns was it was a deliberate attempt to make time stand still. For a year and a half, the clock stopped ticking. And the other thing, which anyone with a financial bent would have noticed, is that it was all being financed by governments who were borrowing indirectly from their central banks at no rate of interest, and in some countries below the rate of interest. So where we got to, and I'm citing here just, I think, quite sort of pithy paragraph by Seth Klarman, probably the best investor in America, a Boston investor who runs something called Baupus Group. And Klarman wrote in his letter to clients at the end of 2020, the idea of persistent low rates has wormed its way into everything: investor thinking, market forecasts, inflation expectations, valuation models, leverage ratios, debt ratings, affordability metrics, housing prices, corporate behavior. Moreover, by truncating downside volatility, forestalling business failures, and postponing the day of reckoning, such policies have persuaded investors that risk has gone into hibernation or simply vanished. And we've slightly, since Klarman wrote those words, there's been, a few sort of cold buckets have been thrown over the investment world. But I then started thinking that what we had done, and I'm finished to say, what we'd done is the world had been turned upside down by these abnormally low interests, and in particular by the negative rates. And so I turned to Lewis Carroll. What I found out is that reading Carroll is that he conceived much of what was going on. In his little-known novel, known as Sylvie and Bruno, he has an outland emperor who wishes to make his subjects twice as rich and establishes a new money act that involves doubling the value of every coin and banknote. I wonder why nobody had ever thought of it before, says the emperor's advisor, the outland professor. And you never saw such universal joy. The shops are full from morning to night. Everybody's buying everything. And then on the other side of the looking glass, Carroll turned conventional values upside down. 2 eggs cost less than 1, and a pun on a speculative promotion, is worth £1,000. Carroll even invented his own cryptographic money order. And in his books, he played with time. Time stands still at the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. The Hatter himself is accused of murdering the time by singing out of tune. And Alice is accused of wasting time. Time is valuable, worth £1,000 a minute. Time's arrow is reversed. The king's messenger is punished before his crime has taken place. The queen cries out in anticipation of the needle pricking her finger. And in Sylvie and Bruno, a bond must be repaid before the money is lent. The outland professor owns a watch with a reversal peg, which causes events to happen in reverse order. So Carroll, I say, would have understood that when the price of time is set at nothing or turns negative and central banks print money without limit, finance itself becomes absurd. So with that, I'll stop, and we'll have a few questions.
Well, Well, I'm not going to ask any questions in the interests of time.
Okay.
But I'm going to do one reading from your book, though. It's not you, but it is a quote from Donald Cohn, Which You Unearth, which I missed. But I think it's really important because I think many people in this audience might say, well, this is all to do with finance and money. But this quote from Cohn shows you that it's much more than that. I think you've done a very good job at explaining that. But let's listen to the horse's mouth as to what interest rates are for. So Donald Cohn was a member of the Federal Open Markets Committee of the Central Bank, which determined the level of interest rates. And this is what he said about what he was doing in 2000, as early as 2004. Policy accommodation and the expectation that it will persist is distorting asset prices. Most of this distortion is deliberate and a desirable effect of the stance of policy. We have attempted to lower interest rates below long-term equilibrium rates and to boost asset prices in order to stimulate demand. So to put that into English, Donald Cohn says, we're trying to make rich people richer. There is running throughout your book, a deep sort of analysis of the social consequences of low interest rates, wrong interest rates, whatever one wants to call them. And interest rate affects all of us every day in every possible way. And if you want to understand that, you should be reading this book.
So a friend of mine read the book, said, oh, Eddie, your book is about social justice, which actually wasn't what I had thought. But there is a chapter, which I call Let Them Eat Credit, on inequality and the interest in inequality. And my argument, Russell alludes to there, is as the interest rates have come down, you see this quite clearly in the United States, household wealth has gone higher and higher, notwithstanding the fact that actually US savings and investment, domestic savings and investment, have been very lackluster. And there looks to be, and one can draw a correlation for what that's worth, between the rising wealth of the 1% and the total returns on a long US Treasury bond. And so at the end of that, and this plays out in many different ways, it's not just people who have assets benefit from the lower rates, but it creates this dimension of intergenerational inequality where young people find it harder to accumulate assets to buy houses and it can expect lower returns on their investment, and in which people in this room who might be hoping to save for retirement have, at least until recently, had to face the prospect of continuously falling returns on annuities. So what I say in my book, some of you may have bought but probably didn't read Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century.
It's just sitting over there. We have a copy in the Library of Mistakes.
So what I found about Piketty's is this Wall Street Journal can actually, I found a piece in the Wall Street Journal that says about Piketty, because Amazon can track your reading habits on Kindle, that 90% of the readers of Piketty didn't get beyond the introduction. So I call it the least read book in history.
What about a brief introduction to Time by...
I think it's overtaken.
Second, is it?
I've overtaken Hawkins, who had the position up until then. And what Piketty, if some of you remember, Piketty has this formula that inequality rises when R, which actually equals the rate of return, is greater than G, the growth rate in the economy. And people have been critical of Piketty, couldn't find any evidence actually to support the thesis. And I then reverse Piketty and say inequality rises when R, which I take to be the rate of interest, is below G, the growth rate. And anyone who's familiar with the sort of Gordon model for valuations, of Gordon growth model, will know that if you take the rate of interest rate down below the growth rate, you're going to get a rise in valuation. So we'll see whether that inversion of Piketty actually sticks.
Right. So we're going to hand over questions now on the subject of social inequality. Who would like to ask the first question? Robert?
That's great. So when do the chickens come home to roost? And is Marx, did he have it all sussed out anyway?
Say it again.
When will the chickens come home to roost? And did Marx have it all worked out a while ago anyway?
Well, I mean, you have these decades-long cycles in bond markets, that last, commonly last half a century or so, and we have just been through probably the greatest bond bull market in history. Where, Russell, tell me, where were U.S. Treasuries at the peak? And were they
14% in 1981? From memory?
Something like that, and then went down to what, 1.4% or something like that. So this, I think, it would, in terms of sort of compression of interest rate yields, is the greatest, not the longest, but fairly long on bull market. And I think that bond bull market is over. I think it is. I mean, when people can lose their jobs by predicting what happening into bond yields. And I think it's over, and that we know that bond bear markets can last just as long as bond bull markets. So really, a lot of the things we've seen, a lot of the the build-up of financial fragility that we've seen with the decline in interest is going to be, we've seen it this year. I mean, I suppose the thesis of this book, had it been published in the middle of last year, when the S&P was still on a tear, people would say, that perhaps I was, being, overly pessimistic, or there were many grounds of thinking that my underlying thesis was incorrect. But I would say, most of everything we've seen this year is sort of supportive of the idea that there's been a turn in the market, and we would say that is the sort of day of reckoning. I mean, as for Marx being right or wrong, I think there are aspects of Marx, that are quite interesting. He talks about he makes actually. I mean, Marx is quite a good financial journalist, and he makes some comment somewhere in Das Kapital that periods of low interest are marked by inordinate swindling, and I think that J.K. Galbraith has this notion in his book The Great Crash of what he calls the bezel of the sort of the sort of what he calls the sort of illusion of wealth that builds up during a sort of a bull market or a speculative moment, and I think so. I think that notion of sort of swindling and bezel we've seen huge amount of in recent years. So I sort of buy that aspect, and then I also sort of one of the points that Lenin makes. It's sort of strange that one finds oneself sort of writing approvingly of Marx and Lenin, but they bear in mind they're making a sort of critique of the vulnerabilities of a capitalist system. One of Lenin's points is that companies are getting sort of bigger and bigger and bigger, and therefore sort of posing a sort of threat. And I point out through the formations of trust and abuse of monopoly, or what we would call rent seeking. And one of the things that's happened in the low interest rate period, facilitated also by lax regulation, is allowing companies to build, to become ever more dominant. And then the trouble, again, what we're seeing now, is that there's not, the financial system or the corporate system is not robust, and the supply chains overextended, and there's too little slack in the system. So I'm not saying that actually leads you to validate the Leninist critique. But what's interesting is that Lenin is also writing about the sort of era of the American trusts that also that occurred at a time of falling and low interest.
You're talking very well about the debasement of money. So I suppose 2 points would be, firstly, today, should I buy gold? Because if you're suggesting that inflation is about to surge, as all of the problems you've described slowly unravel, gold would be an obvious thing to do. Or conversely, because society can't cope with the unraveling which you describe, actually what we continue to see is what Japan has done very successfully for 30 years, which is financial repression, and more financial repression. So which do you actually suggest? Do I buy gold, or do I move to Japan?
Russell, as you probably know, is the world's leading specialist on financial repression. And as for one of the points I make in the book is, or try to make, is I've discussed with you about the inflation of wealth, of asset prices, and I argue that a lot of what we call wealth is really virtual wealth. It's just stuff that has a market price but no underlying economic utility. I mean, one thinks of the crypto currency world as perhaps example, and I mentioned before the massive inflation of U.S. Household wealth, and it seems to me inevitable. I mean, one gets these things wrong, so perhaps I should scratch out the inevitability. But I think that household wealth, measured in terms of purchasing power or relative to GDP, is going to come down over the next decade. And as it comes down, people have again, and we already see this process ongoing, because this year people who've had investments will have lost both mark to market, but leaving aside the fact that the currency in which the investments are denominated is also losing value. So I think that process is likely to continue, and the battle for investment survival will be in finding the sort of the rafts in the ship set off by the shipwreck. And perhaps gold will be one of those. One of those assets. It's difficult, as you probably know, to value gold because it has no stream of income, and having no stream of income, you can't discount it. But as a friend of mine, Felix Martin, who wrote Great History of Money, says, gold is the world's oldest bubble. So perhaps when all other bubbles go, it stays afloat.
I think we're going to struggle to get all your questions in, but let's keep going.
Arguably, the first banks were the grain stores of the first agrarians, and the rats, of course, came in and devalued the currency by eating the grain. But then we domesticated the cats who ate the rats, and thus saved the original value in the first banks. So perhaps it's not bears and bulls, but cats we need. Where are the cats that are going to save us from where we currently are?
Is that a true or a false story? I mean, I know that in Mesopotamia the temples lent out grain. They also lent out silver. So I don't suppose the rats had much luck with the silver. I don't know the history of cattery in the ancient world. I might pass on any deeper answer.
The illusion is, who are the rats and who are the cats today?
The rats eating the... Well, Russell would tell you that in the era of financial repression, the states will take your capital and use it for their own purposes. So they might be your rat, and there's one rat, I suppose. And then but they're not really rat. They're huge. One has to just figure out the risk. But one of the risks that we have is, is the fracturing of globalization, what in the 1930s were called sort of stranded assets. I'm not sure if that's really a sort of ratty problem. And then I suppose, that in that circumstance, then you have to keep your money close to home, but there's problems.
Another question.
Yeah, first of all, can I say I've read your book and I thought it was an excellent read. So I'm definitely not in the Martin Wolf camp, but I'm going to act as a devil's advocate in this story. In as much as the aspect of the saver, and highly elastic money, it's understandable that rates drop to zero. I think what I'd like to focus on is really why, in that environment, with the time preference dropping to now, as it were, we're not seeing a big supply response. And in particular, when money's free and return on capital in the US is effectively at all-time highs, margins at all-time highs, we're not seeing this free money, effectively, with limited time preference at all, being invested, and therefore arbitraging, I guess, these supernormal returns based upon a supernormal, artificially inflated demand, which could be highly sustainable in an environment of highly elastic money, I guess.
So why was not investment response to?
Effectively, one of the interesting things is CapEx depreciation. Basically, from your timeline that you painted,
Why isn't everybody building these highly productive corporate assets, given that the money is cheap?
money's cheap and returns are high.
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't think returns are high across the spectrum. I think some businesses, and what we've seen is very high profits from businesses, with strong monopoly positions or economies of scale in the tech sector. And I would surmise low returns in sectors that have low barriers to entry and where access to capital, where people can borrow and add capital. I mean, think of Uber, the Uber driver, as a little entrepreneur, and the Uber driver able to get a Toyota Prius on lease. You have an oversupply of Uber drivers, and calculations were that Uber drivers, when you factored in the depreciation on their cars, were actually not earning anything at all. And then you have this phenomena of, as I mentioned, of the zombie companies. So even if capital is very low, if you have a sector where capital is not coming out, there's no incentive to put more capital in. And so I mean, in a way, the rationale, one of the rationales for the very low interest rates was that companies there would be an incentive to invest, and we would and that the economies, on the back of rising investment and then rising consumption as people got richer, that the machine would sort of start up and start going again. And really, what I'm trying to examine in this book is why we fell instead into this, what they call secular stagnation, and try to sort of examine the causes of secular stagnation, and then, in the end, sort of try to see it through the prism of the low rates.
So, I mean, to some extent, could it not be argued that regulation, to some extent, especially the incentivizations of CEOs and entrepreneurs, is to buy back their share rather than invest and generate, returns on an NPV basis that generate returns and maximise it for themselves.
Yeah. So the question is it a failure of regulation rather than perhaps of policy or interest? And I mean, that's a valid point, and some economists make that point, and I don't disagree with it, except that I was trying to see the world through my interest rate lens, and therefore I was sort of zoning out on focusing on the other areas. And I'd say, and the only point I did make is that we see the phenomenon of, if you will, low growth and secular stagnation really across the board, even though we have a variety of different regulatory regimes. But yeah, I could probably write a book on how regulation has destroyed economic growth. I think it's probably true too.
Yeah, I was just going to ask a question about the popularity of central bankers. So if you think about the credit crunch period, the central bankers rode in emergency, 0.5% interest rates, and then perpetuated that. I'm thinking particularly of Mark Carney, who was a very populist and very keen to preserve his his own identity, if you like, and didn't have, I believe, and I'm sure others didn't have the ability to do the right thing. The Paul Volcker approach of being almost unpatriotic and do the right thing. Where do we sit now in the central bankers and their strength of character to see through this period?
You have to give...
Edward, you need a 30-second answer.
Yeah, they were. I mean, look, Volcker had very high interest. You know, the Volcker Fed in the early 1980s set up, what was Fed funds rate set to? 16% something? I don't know.
Prime rate was at 20.
Prime rate was 20. The point is that Volcker had, there was a political consensus then to get rid of inflation. And Volcker's argument was, he said he didn't care how high interest rates went because people were fed up with inflation. In the era we've just been living through, in which, for reasons probably unrelated to anything the central bankers themselves did, interest was relatively low, quiescent, people craved asset price inflation. And as long as the central banks could give them asset price inflation against a background of low consumer price inflation, then they were the bee's knees. And now, obviously, we've come to the end of that period, and someone like Governor Bailey at the Bank of England looks to be is widely reviled as an incompetent, hapless, intellectually incredible figure. So yeah, I think the era of central bank credibility is coming to an end.
When I asked you to speak tonight, I was a bit disappointed that you could make it, because I was hoping you'd be at Jackson Hole.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe
email invite must have gone to
and
my
I thought
junk.
Maybe you'd be carrying the ring into Mordor, but obviously you were not invited this year. But next year, I suspect I'll have the Chancellor.
Yeah, we'll see.
The Chancellor session. Just a few announcements to finish. We are serving drinks afterwards. Please stay and join us for a drink. I'd like to thank our drinks sponsor this evening, our friends at Kennox Asset Management. We are back on the 27th of September with Sir Philip Auger discussing his new book, which is a biography of John Stonehouse, who, as far as I know, but there's a lot of knowledgeable people here, but as far as I know, he's the only man who faked his death twice, which is, when you think about it, quite an achievement. That also related to a financial scandal. But obviously my main job in concluding, because his taxi is outside, is to please join me in thanking Edward Chancellor. Let's go before someone grabs you for a question.